and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking from today, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong Boonwurrung people, and pay my respect to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that our panelists from North America are calling in from. Our country's history of violence and dispossession are separate and distinct from the history and present here in Australia, where I'm calling in from. Yet, like so much of history, they rhyme closely with each other. Today's conversation will cover topics including living within Earth's ecological limits, complexity-informed governance, and sharing genuine power with residents, all topics that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Native Americans, First Nations peoples, and other Indigenous peoples around the world have practiced deeply since time immemorial. We have an obligation to learn from and continue integrating these Indigenous knowledges into our practices of civic innovation. Today's webinar is hosted by the Center for Public Impact in collaboration with the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. The Center for Public Impact, CPI, is a global nonprofit working to reimagine government so that it works for everyone. We work towards a future where governments champion the value of human relationships, welcome a culture of learning, and feel empowered to tackle complex challenges. My name is Arthur Shemitz, and I work for CPI Australia, New Zealand. We're also joined today on the panel my colleague Brian McGough from CPI North America. We are truly a global organization, as I see represented in the chat as well, from all of the different places that people are calling in from today. Today, you'll hear brief presentations by our guest speakers from the United States and Canada, responding to the prompt, what problem are we trying to solve and what is our response? Each panelist is going to discuss their unique approach to city innovation. Following their presentations, we'll have a facilitated conversation, including taking questions from the audience. We do have the Q&A function enabled, so please do submit questions throughout the speakers' presentations, and we'll discuss those during our facilitated conversation in the main room, as well as during breakout rooms. After an hour, we'll pivot to those breakout rooms, connect with speakers and each other in more depth, and explore those ideas that have been presented in more depth as well. Following the breakout rooms, we'll close the formal webinar, and then we'll begin the after party, where we'll keep the Zoom room open for those who want to stick around for an informal, unstructured, continued conversation with panelists and with each other. Our intention is to really have this be a participatory webinar that's more than just listening to panelists speak, but where you can really engage, meet the panelists, engage with their ideas, and meet each other as well. Of course, we do recognize that you may be cooking dinner, dropping kids off at school, or doing any number of other tasks at the same time, given that our call today spans many time zones. So during breakout rooms, you're also welcome to stay in the main room, and we'll have an optional journaling prompt to reflect on while you wait for the closing. As some housekeeping, as I noted, the Q&A function is there for you to use to ask and upvote questions. You can access that at the toolbar in the bottom of the Zoom screen. And during the breakout rooms, you'll have the opportunity to engage with panelists in dialogue and ask questions as well. As you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with folks who have registered. If you have to leave early, you can watch the recording to catch up on what you missed, or if you're joining late. I'll note that this is set up as a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, to allow for breakout rooms. So your video will be present in the recording if watched in gallery mode. While we'd love to see your face, you're also welcome to turn off your video if you're uncomfortable with your video being in the recording. I'll also plug the different community spaces that our organizations have. I'll invite you to join the Center for Public Impact Reimagining Government Community of Practice on Slack to connect with our global community of changemakers interested in reimagining government so that it works for everyone, as well as to join the Community for Flourishing Enterprise mailing list and LinkedIn group to discuss management innovation, share applied research work, and form collaborations for research and advising engagements. And I'm dropping those in the chat now so that you have those links on hand. I'll let our panelists introduce themselves. Here's again an overview of our webinar structure for today, our speakers, our breakout rooms, our share back, and our after party. Our hope overall is that you leave today with a sense of possibility and starting to build a constituency of like-minded folk who share a desire to do things differently. With that, I'll get us started with our presentations today and stop sharing my screen. Our first panelist today is Brian McGough from the Center for Public Impact North America.
Great. Thank you, Arthur. So as Arthur said, I work for Center for Public Impact, or also CPI, North America. Arthur has traveled to Australia to work with our Australian New Zealand team. But no matter kind of where we sit at CPI, our goal is really to reimagine government. And there's a lot of different pillars that CPI thinks about doing this, but the one that I'm most familiar with and has spent the last 2.5 years working on alongside Arthur is our sort of government innovation portfolio. In no small part, this portfolio has been shaped by our partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation at Johns Hopkins and Harvard as well. So everything that you're seeing here represents CPI's perspective, but is also a very much collective partnership driving the impact that you see. So the standard prompt, kind of like what problem are we trying to solve, is kind of captured in these 3 paragraphs as most succinctly as I could put it, which is as we as civil servants or people partnering with civil servants, the traditional way of problem solving is to sort of meet in a room with our regular colleagues and identify a solution, right? We have a housing crisis trying to solve gun violence. We are working on permitting, and we start in a room that looks quite like this. At the same time, though this feels very routine and very sort of familiar to us, it feels stuck. The ideas that emerge are, as I said, familiar, they're more certain, they're realistic, and it's driven by a sense of fear, both very practical and imagined, of risk. What if we fail? What if we waste taxpayers' dollars? What if we, make a fool of ourselves in the administration? All of these very kind of real constraints, right? And so in doing that, we sort of decide on a solution and we build it all at once, letting these constraints, both real and imagined, kind of guide the way, thinking along the lines of time, resources, and risks. I spent 2 years working embedded in a city government. This felt very true, and it feels true also for some teams that join us on our programs here at CPI. So as a result, the dynamic that this creates is that the solutions that we generate feel divorced from resident needs and experiences. We miss opportunities to learn and evolve our solutions toward even better solutions. And we are relying on few ordinary avenues instead of a network of possibilities and partners. So this is the problem of sorts. And our process, usually it's a lot more colorful, but in this case, I tried to simplify it as much as I could. Is essentially in this case the civic design or innovation process. We think about innovation in terms of both design plus implementation. And where we start with cities at the very beginning of our 9-month engagement with them is deeply understanding the root cause of the problem. For human-centered designers, this might look like blue sky ethnographic research. How can I understand if I'm trying to develop new solutions to homelessness, the realities of people who are unhoused and navigating our shelter system? Well, I think what we notice is this is a very pivotal moment for a lot of cities, even if some people on the team feel versed in the insights that are emerging. It is the collective experience of forming a new team around these questions and living and breathing sort of the experiences that can really shape the momentum and the trajectory within the city. So all of that happens through the synthesis and storytelling process. until we ultimately reach ideation and co-design, where we sit back down with residents once again to generate solutions with the people that are most impacted by the solutions that we'll generate. This is often perhaps like the apex pinnacle of sort of momentum on the project and where people really get to see the insights translating into practical initiatives. From there, there's an opportunity to learn through prototyping and piloting before we ultimately kind of craft a portfolio of solutions that really stands in contrast to that last slide of sort of thinking about a silver bullet realistic solution, but instead to consider a portfolio of 8 to 10 short-term, long-term, practical, bold solutions that are all with their own mechanisms working to solve the problem. So what this looks like in photos, these are pictures that I've collected from across different projects at CPI. But we've got from recycling projects. Actually, Arthur is in this photo. He was working with Hobart in Australia on recycled waste, and he and his co-facilitator visited alongside city participants the landfill, understanding the experiences of waste workers, the behavior of residents that was leading to the landfill being filled with the trash that it was, all of that generating insights, right? And you can see here that Arthur led the team through a process not only of writing insights, but also visualizing them, giving them an identity, giving them life and a story to breathe. From there, these are actually two photos that I pulled from a project that I did with a city around prototyping solutions, fast and inexpensive, composting prototypes that essentially were just bins that we got from the store, put a sticker on it, and try to run it as a lottery to see if we could get people interested in composting. And then, of course, there's the mechanism around iterative learning, right? So actually going out and measuring and observing behavior to understand the impact of the initiatives that you're launching as you pilot them in real time. Um, all of this sort of like, I hope, gives a little bit of life to the process that I spoke to, and I'm happy to share more sort of about the cities that we've worked with. I have a slide on impact for later in this presentation, but really kind of the foundation of our work being collaboration with residents as opposed to a collaboration of with your kind of regular peers. A iterative learning based process as opposed to sort of a one size fits all, build it all at once approach, and an embrace, I think, of failure and mistakes. Similarly, believing that you start small, you learn quickly, and then you'll be able to measure impact and create better solutions through that. So thank you for time. I think I'm under the 10-minute mark, which is great. And I will pass it back to Arthur.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Brian. Yes, you're correct. You were very efficient on time and much appreciated. Our next speakers are Randy Sod, as well as Ting Pan from the Flourishing Enterprise Institute and the city of Nanaimo, respectively.
Thanks so much for the intro, Arthur, for the presentation, Brian, and for the collaboration on the session. Nice to meet some people from outside of our network and community of practice and to connect with others who are part of the CPI network. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about our world and engaging in some dialogue. Maybe for starters, I'll just mention quickly that the Flourishing Enterprise Institute that I'm here on behalf of is an organization that's interested in this idea of what it looks like to enable organizations to flourish. And as part of that, a significant aspect of our focus is on bringing applied research to the practical testing of innovations in the field that are designed to transform how we understand and practice organizational management. So I'd like to share a little bit of our perspective, similar to how Brian talked about reimagining government. Of course, FEI is similarly focused and interested, yet our own unique approach is slightly different and distinct. So I'd like to comment a little bit on what we see as the problem that we're trying to solve and the approach that we've been taking to the challenge, including a couple of examples that I'll touch on, one being some work we've done with the City of Kitchener, and then I'll pass to my colleague Ting, who I had the pleasure of working with over a couple of years through her role at the City of Nanaimo, and she'll share a little bit about an example of the work that we've done there and some of the learnings that we've taken away. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and begin with our perspective on the challenge. So when we think about the sort of history and lineage of municipal government, what we understand and what's well documented in the literature is that the field, the sector, has been defined for the past several decades by a paradigm of management called the New Public Management. So it's in short, a bunch of business practices that were repurposed for the public sector. And essentially, organizations or municipalities became service optimization, service delivery optimization organizations, or they were designed, their internal systems were designed to optimize the function of service delivery. And I think what we see, especially as the sustainability of the world is challenged and we have increasingly complex issues emerging, purpose of government is emerging into a different space. And we see many embracing this idea of enabling community well-being and resilience. And the issue that we see is that there is a fundamental mismatch between the system of management designed for optimizing service delivery and this emergent purpose of enabling community well-being. For what it's worth, in the Google Doc that I shared a little earlier, we've just finished publishing a paper that talks about this lineage, the nature of complex adaptive systems, and the need for municipalities to transition from more conventional best practice towards systemic management practice. You're welcome to have a peek at it in case that's of interest. This is a bit of a summary of what you might find in that paper, which speaks to this transition from conventional towards more systemic management practices. So historically speaking, conventional best practice has been relatively compartmentalized and internally focused, whereas we see systemic practices that are better aligned to the complexity we're experiencing as being more integrative, as in considerate of how the organization depends on and impacts wider entities and systems. And it also recognizes the many interconnections of the challenges and opportunities that we're responding to and dealing with. So the idea of isolation doesn't function as well. Another perspective is, historically, or at least in terms of best practice, municipalities have functioned in a rather controlling and insular manner, independently pursuing goals within siloed departments and trying to maintain power and control. And the emergent possibility as we look towards more systemic practices to counter this with a more collective approach, as in pursuing objectives within more flexible transdisciplinary teams and fostering healthy and cooperative relationships with all stakeholders, not limited to the public. Further, when we look at sort of how we think about the future, typically municipalities have functioned in a more linear and reactive manner, and we would see systemic practices as being more adaptive, as in able to anticipate and aim to identify root causes of complex challenges and to design processes and structures that are more responsive, understanding that, with emergence and uncertainty, we may need to rely more on experimentation and failure as part of how we navigate. In terms of the transition, I think the key from our end is that if we want to move beyond incremental progress, we need to shift mindsets and transform strategic management practices. So certainly we see systemic approaches to addressing challenges and systems thinking becoming more prevalent in the municipal sector. But I think the challenge when we see the complex systemic issues that are emerging is that often the focus resides up here at the upper layers of the iceberg in terms of lower level policy development and planning being what's affected, or just point projects and actions that are taken. And I guess maybe dissimilarly, if we do have shifts in mindsets where there's an embracing and a more willingness to embrace, a greater willingness to embrace systems thinking and related approaches, sometimes that's embraced in theory or principle or conceptually, and what's then needed to navigate the complexity of operationalizing that from a strategic management perspective is still a huge gap. And I don't think it is reasonable to expect that senior leaders in municipalities or other organizations can just figure out how to make sense or how to effectively apply systems theory within their organizations in a truly rigorous and thorough manner. And so I point to the solution that the FEI has been co-developing with many partners, which we refer to as Enterprise Evolution. So Enterprise Evolution is essentially a capability development program that's designed to enable organizations to adapt to accelerating change and increasing complexity by transitioning from conventional best practice towards systemic strategic management practices. And as part of that process, to essentially build the capability to do it on their own, not to be reliant on outside parties. So in terms of the scope of the program, we refer to something that has been developed in literature called the window of strategic management, which we've adapted a little bit here. And it helps us kind of point to the scope of what's necessary, because as much as we're focused on kind of traditional, what someone might think of as an explicit or concrete management practice, there's far more that's within the scope of the transformation that we're interested in. So going from the center outwards, typically what's in the center, the layers of transformation or the areas of the organization that we intend to transform are more simple, straightforward, easy to understand, and easy to transform. And as we get further out, things are less concrete, more difficult to make sense of, and much more difficult to transform. So we begin in the middle with strategic functions, where the goal is, again, to develop systemic practices that align with the complexity we face. That includes aligning with the natural and social sciences. Beyond that, we talk about relationships. So this has much to do with governance, both relationships across the organization and between the organization and the outside world. Beyond that, we have leadership and organizational capabilities. And ultimately, we're constrained by what we might accomplish in transforming practices or even the ways that we engage with others if the leaders and the teams within organizations don't have the new capabilities that are necessary to lead those practices effectively. And finally, and perhaps most supremely, we have culture. And ultimately, we can transform many things, but culture will remain an impressive constraint if we don't address what's perhaps misaligned in terms of how culture enables this more systemic and evolutionary view of organizational management. In terms of how the program works, it is a very flexible one. I think what I'd mention off the top is that no municipality signs up to transform their organization and all of their practices top to bottom at the onset. So typically we start with some sort of an entry point, whether that's engaging with a complex systemic issue, a specific management need, or a professional development opportunity. So we would typically work with organizations. The scope of EE is broad, but we would start somewhere where there is a priority, a motivation, a need. The idea would be we would start by looking at the practices currently employed. We'd identify several systemic innovations and hand in hand, co-design new practices or new ways of doing things, leveraging those systemically designed innovations. We would then facilitate the process with them of executing those practices. And the idea is that we would create a space where individuals have the opportunity to learn by doing. So by getting their hands dirty and having the necessary expertise and guidance alongside them, they have the experience of doing it themselves and learning through the experience. And finally, based on that experience and reflection on it, there's an opportunity to see what's been learned, what worked, what didn't work, and how systemic practices were enabling and in most cases better, and to think about how these practices could be institutionalized as in continued as they are and expanded to be applied in different areas or through other processes that are led within the organization. And I think for us, the most important thing is to understand that this is an iterative and long transition. As people engage with systemic innovations and new ways of doing things, our experiences, they start to build a comfort and they naturally develop a deeper understanding of what it looks like to function systemically and why that's advantageous organizationally. And the appetite for going further or to explore further tends to grow. So I'll share just a little bit about our work with the City of Kitchener. We engaged in a 3-year process with the city. They were essentially interested in adapting their approach to strategic planning. And as part of that 2-year strategic planning process, they also wanted to create a new vision for the future. We started the whole thing off working on or engaging them in a workshop series. It was their senior leadership team who we engaged. We talked a little bit about sort of what wasn't working from their perspective about strategic planning historically. We essentially presenced a systemic perspective of the world and kind of talked about what's happening from a sustainability perspective and why we're in the mess that we are, the fact that things are likely to get much, much worse, and gave them the opportunity to consider how or the need to adapt practices while we have time and while there's an opportunity versus waiting until the conventional practices, which perhaps aren't a good match for the complexity emerging, truly fail them. So we created a tailored strategy lab where they got to experiment with a couple of systemic innovations that we had curated for them, putting them up against a challenge they had dealt with during their previous strategic planning process. And they got the opportunity to see what a systemically designed set of innovations can do in terms of helping them to navigate that same complexity. And their experience, I think, simply was that they found it made things explicit that weren't. It allowed them to be rigorous and comprehensive in a way that they hadn't been. And it allowed them to build a shared understanding and an opportunity to navigate eyes wide open with more confidence and a sense that they were just more, they had more deeply and thoroughly engaged with all of the considerations that they feel are important and they say are important to their constituents. And so through that experience, they gained enough confidence to say, like, yes, let's do strategic planning differently. We spent a couple of years doing that. And some of the results were quite interesting and unexpected. This was quite an experiment for us as well. So just a couple of highlights. I won't go into everything just in the interest of time, but I guess I'll mention quickly that they went, in terms of developing a vision, they saw the sort of inauthenticity of writing a simple sentence with 3 adjectives as a way of envisioning the future. It led them to think about their role in creating a vision for Kitchener, the place. They ended up deciding to develop a story that was defined by community level goals and that was informed by a strategic foresight process, which really dislodged them from thinking about the future by being anchored to the current situation and what things look like today. In terms of participation, senior leadership certainly ended up naturally and on their own accord, relinquishing a lot of control over the process and empowering others to have a greater role in defining what would be set. Strategy itself evolved. So typically the city, like many, at least in Canada, the cities would cast 4 years of actions at the conclusion of the strategic planning process. And I think they saw the inauthenticity of this as in their past strategic planning process, they saw that once they were past 6 or 12 months, most of what became strategic for the city wasn't anticipated because the rate of change and the number of issues emerging that they had to respond to, whether a pandemic, homelessness, an opioid crisis, a Black Lives Matter movement, weren't things that they had thought of, and they became the most pressing issues. So they actually accepted this idea that strategy would become a living, breathing process, and that instead of casting a whole bunch of actions which they executed with accountability, they created a discipline of adjusting priorities, strategic priorities over time and in response to how community needs evolved. So there was a relearning, and that did not happen at the onset, and it was not predictable. It wasn't something we told them to do. It was an emergent outcome that happened as a result of experimenting with many different innovations. And maybe finally, I'll just mention that alongside understanding strategy as a living, breathing process, they also accepted it as sort of a meta-level prioritization process. And they decided to reflect it organizationally by having the strategic priorities that were ongoingly evolved reflected in their annualized business planning and budgeting processes. So as priorities changed, they would take those priorities and apply them to their annualized processes so that they were reflected in lower level planning processes and they had a more integrated view of planning rather than having a whole bunch of disparate planning processes that just overlapped and didn't necessarily effectively talk to each other. Yeah, so I think I'll pause there and I'd like to just quickly introduce my colleague Ting Pan of the city of Nanaimo. She's the manager of sustainability there. I met Ting, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago. She had been involved in a process the city was leading, applying the donut economics model that I imagine many of you are familiar with. Ting and I connected and discussed a systemic management innovation that has been very central within the Flourishing Enterprise Institute sphere called context-based sustainability. Plenty of references related within the Google Doc in case you're interested. And Ting is going to tell you a little bit about her experience working with her colleagues and eventually working with us and collaborating on the process of implementing context-based sustainability at Nanaimo. Over to you, Ting.
Hey, thank you, Randy, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. So as Randy mentioned, that I'm the manager of sustainability with the city of Nanaimo. We're a coastal city in British Columbia, Canada. And so this process, the projects, just to provide a bit of context, we had this opportunity a couple of years ago to update our official community plan. And this is the most important overarching plan to set a vision for our city for the next 25 to 30 years. And as part of that process, our counselors start to ask the question, especially those who are sitting on our environment committee, and wondering, you know, it seems like we have done a lot of projects and we're busy doing these initiatives, but how come we don't feel like we're making real progress? And what will be a framework to help us see, you know, where how we can measure and see progress towards those ultimate goals, and how do we define that? And so, you know, credit to the leadership of our council, they really embraced the idea of the donut economics with this idea that we should all live within the limits of the environment we're in and be able to provide the foundational needs of everyone. And so that's kind of the background. And my role in it is that, so we have the city plan, which sets up this high level vision and the policies. And then we have two companion documents to support the implementation of that vision. One is kind of like a library of actions, and it's called Integrated Action Plan. And then there is a monitoring strategy, which I got the pleasure of taking on. And the monitoring strategy is meant to tell us you know, what indicators we need to use to be able to measure how we're making progress towards these really ambitious goals, and then being able to report back and help us gain insights and see where we need to make adjustments, what actions that are effective and we should continue to do, and what are the things that we should consider changing. Because we have a limited time here and it's a huge process, I'm just going to speak at a very high level some of the challenges that we encountered when we're trying to adopt and embrace this very ambitious and framework and try to downscale it at a local level. So the donut economics was really looking from a global perspective, and then so when we're looking at the city, and you know, trying to answer these questions of, okay, if we want to live within the environmental limit and also providing that social foundations to everyone, and that's a threshold-based kind of framework. And how do we know then if we don't want to cross those lines in terms of environmental limits, or you know, what is the kind of foundational needs that is necessary? How do we define those thresholds? It becomes really important. And so we took a look at, you know, all the indicators that we have used in the past and has been suggested. And there are like so many, hundreds. And typically the approach that we take looking at, you know, which indicators to pick to monitor our progress are really limited to the kind of indicators that we use operationally. You know, what is available, what is, you know, kind of possible to acquire on a regular basis. There are a lot of these practical considerations. And I think where when we started engaging with Refocus and working with Randy and his team, that kind of a shifted orientation, because the framework is ultimately a threshold-based model. And so if we were to be authentic about, you know, to that framework and really thinking about, you know, how the indicators can tell us if we're within the safe threshold or not, then we really need to look at these indicators more critically and see if they could signal us whether those are, you know, that indicates whether we're in a safe zone or not, and if we're providing sufficient resources to meet our needs. So that's kind of the big orientation. And so we started this different process of looking at okay, at the local level, how do we define our goals? What is the kind of sustainability end goals? And starting from there, and looking at, okay, here's the areas of impact we have as a city, and what is the kind of end goal that we would like to achieve in terms of whether it's climate change, whether it's water resource, or homelessness, or housing, and is there any kind of a science or ethics-based goals that we can articulate? So the conversation starts there, and sometimes it's a really kind of collaborative process with my colleagues across the organization, and we ask the question, how can we define this goal? And just to give you a very quick example that I think most cities will track, for example, water consumptions per household. And we have been using that indicator for a very long time. And we set targets and we beat them. And, we feel pretty good about it. But when we ask the question of how do we know if we have sufficient water over 20, 30 years to sustain the city, that's a very different question. And it was really interesting is that, when we went to our water service team, and then they were like, oh, we know how to do this. And we actually look at, the water reservoir level that cannot go below 30% at any time of the year. And so that was a really interesting conversation that really never came up. But, they have developed this insight and a way of knowing whether we have sufficient water. And so that really changed how we track our performance, because that takes into account, the population growth. It takes into account, increasing drought. We still track, water consumption per household, but that becomes a kind of a secondary and a supportive indicator. What's more important is what is connected to our end goal. And so I think that's just one example of, how some of those, conversations across the organization with different departments and really provides that additional insight when we ask the question of, what is ultimately we want to achieve. And then the second thing I want to mention then in terms of the challenge and how we dealt with this is building some comfort with the unknown. We quickly realized, and I'm sure this is not unique to us, that we don't have all the data that we want to have. When we ask those questions, often the answer is not really clear. So we do realize that we need to invest in either collecting the data or engaging with external experts, and or repackaging and analyzing our existing data. And in the end, when we're presenting the monitoring strategy, we didn't have everything figured out. And if you go to our city website and go to city plan monitoring, some of the indicators are still blank. And so how do we deal with the challenge of, the temptation of filling in that blank with what we have is, one thing that we did is we differentiated with their like two different kinds of indicators. The key indicators are the ones that, really give us a high level kind of view, and it's very limited in numbers. We only have 23 key indicators. It tells us kind of the big pictures. And then we have the supportive indicators. These can be operational, can be incremental. We recognize that they're still useful. It still tells us, what's happening on the ground, but they're not necessarily connected to the kind of the long-term sustainability goals. So once we differentiate them, then I feel like, our organization has a bit more comfort in being okay with not having the answers and having that, all the data for the key indicators, because we do have these other things and it will take time to develop, the knowledge and expertise and the data that we need. And then in terms of how it affects our organization, I would say that one of the things, the big takeaways is like it's an ongoing process for sure. And we're trying to build in some process and have some building some organizational capacity to continue this work. So even though city plan has been adopted and a monitoring strategy was endorsed, the work continues. And our city put some budget invested in continue to support the monitoring work, and also this spring, we put forward a recommendation to actually have an internal data management and interpretation team, so that we have key staff. And again, it's not a really big group, but it was involving our IT and 5 kind of the perspectives that is connected to our long-term vision, to come together regularly to talk about some best practices and how we can understand each other's data source and practices, and how the insights in our discipline also informs decisions in a different insight point. So that's just starting. We had our first meeting, and the goal was really that we can build up that muscle of understanding the interconnections, and have a bit of support internally to try to bring this knowledge to senior management to help inform decisions at our council. So we'll just stop there. That's probably more than 10 minutes now, but happy to answer questions later. Back to you, Randy.
And I'll kick back over to Arthur. Thanks.
And thanks so much, Randy and Ting, for sharing such a thoughtful presentation. I hear a lot of both, areas of resonance and areas of divergence in all the presentations. I think what feels like it is really uniting thread in everything we've heard today is really a move from traditional ways of working and traditional government processes towards a more systemic approach, whether that's thinking about the broader ecosystem, whether that's thinking about complex adaptive systems and managing in those, or thinking about moving towards a portfolio-based approach to solving problems rather than assuming that a single silver bullet solution can make the difference and solve the complex problems that we face. And I also see lots of areas of divergence as well, lots of ways in which we, I'm sure, if faced with the same challenge, would approach it from different angles and use each of our individual superpowers to be able to tackle it. So I'll move us now into some conversation between our panelists. And I'd love to start with a question about learning. You all have been working in this field for a number of years and developing the approaches that you've used. I'd love to hear more about what you've learned, what you found worked, what hasn't worked as well, and what some of those key takeaways are you've learned that you integrate into your work, and as well for our audience who are all, I imagine, either practitioners of city innovation themselves or keen to learn more about it, the takeaways that our friends in the audience can learn to be more effective, both as we on the panel continue to scale our work, as well as the audience as well.
Great, thank you, Arthur. I can kick us off. I actually, one of the learnings that I was going to share really resonated with one of the slides that you had, Randy, which was sort of around our portfolio-based approach. So at the end of our process, our 9-month program, capacity building around design and innovation, like I mentioned, cities should have a portfolio of initiatives that tackle whatever problem area they are looking to solve: gun violence, homelessness, permitting, sidewalks. And the portfolio of initiatives, I think, can be a really hard thing to wrap your head around first, which is, what are the right ideas that go in here, right? How do we prioritize from these hundreds of ideas that we've ideated in these co-design sessions with residents, all the way down to something that's 8 to 10? But then it's the larger question after our program ends that sustains itself over time is, how do we manage this? And so one of the biggest barriers that we see to the management of a successful portfolio is the silos of departments, right? Not knowing how, not being enabled either fiscally or organizationally to manage cross-functional, cross-department projects. And at the same time, to feel that there isn't necessarily an organizational role to be overseeing multiple projects across departments either. And so, Randy, when you were talking about compartmentalization, it's a challenging word to say, and your kind of phase toward integration, I think one of the things that we really see is that the first step for really successful cities that manage a portfolio is it takes somebody who is really well connected, often within their city government, sometimes mid to senior level, that's really helping to unlock the barriers, putting people in charge of specific initiatives within the portfolio on specific time horizons. And that can work for cities that are really just trying to start an innovation function. Over time, then I think we see cities do things like hire chief innovation officers or set up innovation departments where portfolios like this can maybe live more concretely, or they work as sort of internal consultancies to help people with different projects. So I think that really resonated with our work and some of the learnings that we see, which is to incubate a portfolio within a program is one thing, but then to help cities navigate the organizational barriers around that is a longer, sometimes 18 to 24-month process.
I can jump in with a few key learnings from our project work and engagement with cities as well. I think I mentioned this idea already of enterprise evolution, recognizing that we're trying to enable a long transition, that shifting from conventional towards systemic practices and building the necessary capabilities is not something we do through 1-2 year engagement or something of that nature. It requires many iterative cycles of transformative change. And I think the key from our end has been recognizing what's important is to start where there is motivation, a need, momentum, already existing priority, etc., and to build from there. I think as we look at kind of the landscape, especially in terms of what's not working in municipal government, our experience is that senior leaders are universally experiencing the challenges of navigating accelerating change and increasing complexity, and engaging them on the basis not necessarily of a conversation about sustainability or community issues that need to be resolved, but just the idea of adapting strategic management to match the complexity of the circumstances, the conditions that they're struggling with, tends to be a motivating proposition, especially when we can introduce systemically designed management innovations that are essentially fit for the task. And so part of the learning has been that there is an opportunity to kind of jump past the corporate sustainability or sustainability narrative and the limitations associated with it, and to have the means to engage with senior leaders where the kind of change that can begin, to your point, Brian, about having someone more senior who can champion change and make sure that it's carried out, is a possibility. So that's become very central for us as we engage, often starting with sustainability champions, planners, etc. We look to transition to become a voice that is able to appeal to and engage with senior leaders. I think another thing that's interesting in the learning is around the nature of systems theory or systems thinking as it applies in practice. In my head, I would almost think about systems theory or systems thinking as having many different layers of depth at which it can be applied. And I think for any individual, from wherever they stand or whatever they are capable of envisioning today based on their knowledge and experience, they can maybe see a couple of layers further down. So if we try to convince them or compel them with a vision of how to understand or see things systemically that is too far a stretch, it will just go over their heads. They won't be able to make sense of it. They won't be motivated by it or see its applicability inside of how they're able to make sense of the world. And so this is where I think the skill becomes in designing and facilitating, in that the key is to understand where your audience is, where those leaders who you're engaging happen to be, and ultimately stretching them so that they are challenged towards the limits of what they can perceive and see, but not so far that it no longer makes sense or appeals in a tangible or concrete manner. Maybe a last one, or last two quick ones, would be that I think we've also recognized that transforming an aspect of management or the organization in isolation doesn't actually create the intended benefits. So for example, in Nanaimo, and I use Nanaimo just as an example, I'm not going to comment on what their planning processes are because I don't know what they are. They transform their performance management or accounting practices and now have insights that are thresholds aligned, that align with science and ethics-based thresholds, and they can make sense of sustainability in a truly authentic manner. That's brilliant insight. But if their approach to planning remains conventional and they don't have the capability to see across multiple time horizons and to be adaptive and responsive and to plan in a collective way that is necessary in order to achieve community level goals that aren't within their control, they won't get the benefits, or at least not the full benefits of those insights. So there's a limitation to transforming isolated aspects of the organization without system-wide change. And I think that's where that expansive and iterative approach becomes very important. And finally, just the transformation doesn't happen in a predictable manner. You know, so much of our time spent with Kitchener, specifically given how broad and long our process was like just negotiating back and forth about what practices we would use and how we would compromise things based on time constraints, budgetary constraints, people's own exhaustion, etc. And it was just amazing how over time, looking at various practices, changing things, and giving people the opportunity to experience what they would normally do differently just resulted in outcomes that we couldn't have predicted or known would happen. So there's a degree of patience and accepting the emergent nature of this change that I think is very necessary in order to achieve success. I'll pause there.
Wonderful. Thanks both for sharing your reflections. I'll ask one more question before we start to move to a question from our audience. So if we could keep to, let's try to go for a snappy 1 to 2 minutes for this question. So we'll have time for our audience questions and then into our breakout rooms. But the last question that I have for y'all is what's next and where do we go from here? So as an organization, as an individual, what is your future outlook? And what plans do you have in place for advancing that work, including any opportunities for the folks in our conversation today to get involved in that work?
I can jump in. I think, well, we're thinking about a lot of things in terms of the changing landscape of government, especially in the US. Where we often talk, we have often talked this year about how government is actively being reimagined within the United States, but in a way, you know, that doesn't align with our vision for government. I think one of the things that we're thinking about as a portfolio is expanding reach and impact. And perhaps the simplest way to put it is how can we reach more people with a similar level of investment? The tensions I think that we feel, and it almost speaks to your point, Randy, which is part of what's so powerful about the programs that we run now is that they're incubators of change that then have kind of enough of a catalyst to kind of spread out over time into an organization, right? And so it's because we fostered new teams, incubated new relationships within the city around a new problem area that there is such like a seismic sort of momentum underneath. At the same time, you know, there's questions around how can you get new ideas into more hands quicker with less levels of investment, both in terms of our investment, but in terms of time spent on the city's end in capacity building. And so I'm curious for the different models of capacity building that are less intensive and models that can inspire the same sort of mindset, behavior, and organizational change, but maybe in a lighter touch. We don't have an answer for that yet, certainly, but in our own sort of like prototype iterative learning ethos, we're trying a few new things this year to get closer to that answer.
Beautiful. I think I can share a little bit as well, unless there's any pressing questions, Arthur. I think nothing that's come up for me in the chat. Am I good to jump in?
Absolutely, please do.
Perfect. So yeah, in terms of where we're heading, one of the key initiatives that the FEI has helped to found is a partnership called Municipalities Adapting in Response to Complexity. So we've partnered with the ICLE World Secretariat, along with Veris, which is a research center at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. And our interest is really to explore, test, and develop enterprise evolution and any number of other systemic innovations within the municipal sector, with this idea of, again, shifting mindsets and transitioning towards more systemic strategic management practices. And so the goal is really to bring together academic researchers from across disciplines, municipal sector NGOs that are very much in the game or in the work of developing best practice, developing programming, and helping municipalities to do what they do more effectively, and to bring together the municipalities themselves so that we essentially have both our test participants and our audience at the same time learning together, informing how we experiment, explore, and mobilize and scale change. If that's something that's of interest to individuals, certainly reach out. There's no formal commitment. It's more just being part of the partnership, and depending on the project or initiative we undertake, there's certainly different roles or opportunities to get more or less involved. A particular area that we've been exploring at the moment is a project based around accelerating municipal climate action through an approach called low carbon resilience that was developed at Simon Fraser University. We see that very much as, an ideal entry point for a broader enterprise evolution transformation process. But just an example of a project that has been developed within the MARC partnership. The other I'll mention really quickly is as part of further developing enterprise evolution. Enterprise evolution was a project that was co-founded amongst myself and 3 other colleagues. We decided to nest it within the FEI as a stewarding organization that would be seen as both credible and unbiased. The goal is to essentially further develop the program and to mobilize that so many others around the world could learn about it as a frame and a programmatic approach and use that effectively. So recognizing the challenge with doing that off the side of our desks and without a whole bunch of funding, we've created a collective of about 35, 40 academics, innovators, organizations globally who have an interest in seeing enterprise evolution develop further and be applied more widely, who are collectively building some of the foundations we need, including an academically rigorous concept, or the concept of an evolutionary enterprise, which we hope to define in quite a bit of detail, a set of universal services and marketing materials that can be leveraged, and then a facilitation, training, and guidance model that we could use to essentially enable others to take advantage of this. We're not sure what the business model will look like yet, but the goal is to, amongst this group of 40 or so, see what it's like to go from our 4 to training up others to use enterprise evolution within whatever way they see comfortable and fit, such that we have an idea of what it might look like to expand that training and development to others. So again, if you're interested in the Enterprise Evolution Development Project and potentially using it or being involved in applying it, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks so much, both. It's so exciting to hear about both the successes that you've already had in this work and the scaling and iterating that you all are looking to moving forward. We have a question in the Q&A that I want to ask to Brian before we head into breakout rooms. We have a question from Arjory, apologies if I mispronounced your name, asking about Chief Innovation Officers, observing that many of those programs in Canadian cities have stopped or not been able to continue, and asking, why you think that is, and if it has to do with that outer layer of culture and capabilities that Randy spoke to. So Brian, would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, great question. Well, I'll have to say I'm less familiar with the Canadian context, but I'd almost be curious for you to provide a little bit more context if you feel comfortable, and then maybe I can just offer a reflection based on what we're seeing here in the US. But of course, if not, that's fine as well.
I can provide more context. Is it okay if I unmute myself, Arthur? Sure. It's a weird position to be in thinking about it because I'm also like a city staff. So I'm like, how do I articulate this? But from an outside in perspective of somebody who has nothing to do with civic innovation offices, it appears that I think changing priorities or a lack of institutionalization may take it may, I guess, like have some impact, possibly changing priorities. When civic innovation offices started here in around 2017, I believe it was, or 2019, I can't remember the year now. I think like cities were in a very different place. It was pre-COVID. But even when they started kind of shutting down, it was still pre-COVID. So other than changing priorities and focusing on maybe economics or other fiscal issues, I'm not too sure what else is going on. But from the American perspective, I would like to hear from you.
Yeah. Oh man, this is an interesting question. I'd also be curious to open it up to the panelists or the rest of the group. So I think um, some of the my initial reaction is that some of the pushback that we see about innovation, and I wouldn't say this is the primary pushback, but one of it is that it could be seen just as like a superfluous, like nice to have function. A lot of people also understand it as being or related to continuous improvement, though a lot of the innovation that we talk about and build capacity in is a lot more organization-wide, blue sky problem solving. So I think, you know, what we would say to a lot of people is actually innovation doesn't require an institutionalization in the form of a chief innovation officer, an innovation department, or even a written strategy. That a lot of people who come through our programs start just by adopting like the mindsets and the skills that they kind of practice through our programs. One of my favorite stories, it was like one of the first that I heard 2.5 years ago, is a woman in Ottawa had gone through and she was doing a feasibility study on a public beach. And she was like, oh, in addition to this kind of traditional thing, I'm going to run interviews with residents that are actually on the beach and get their perspective on how we should like kind of reimagine the space. And so that was a ultimately and cost-effective, free kind of way that she took it upon herself to kind of integrate these methods into her work. So I would say like there's obviously, as cities face budget cuts, declines in revenue in the US, a lot of political challenges, I could imagine why innovation departments could be a function that is under the microscope. At the same time, I think the innovation methods are precisely cheaper, faster ways to get to better answers. And so we almost encourage people to do it in times of austerity because you can do it with few resources if you're willing to embrace the creativity of it. I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but that's what came off the top of my head. Also curious if anybody else had a thought on that.
Anna, go ahead.
Thank you. I could chime in on that one and sort of double click on what you've just shared, Brian. I think there has been a pattern over many years of trying to address a problem by creating a role like a chief innovation officer or a chief sustainability, like all of these sort of chief roles. And this has been part of the compartmentalization problem and the siloing that puts the monkey on the back, the accountability on a single role, and tends to segregate these. It becomes a very difficult role to carry out and to deliver against those accountabilities. And invariably, it falls short. These things fail. And so the work that you all have been describing and is very much around how do we seed a much more systemic way, interconnected way of understanding the entangled nature of this work, and not segregate these challenges so much. I mean, this is even one of the problems with the 17 SDGs. When we look at them, they're all interconnected. You cannot deal with one SDG without bumping up against the others. And so this is part of the challenge I think we're facing in government, but also in business and across all sectors, is finding ways to learn how to hold more complexity and to do it together, because the reality is no one person can embrace enough of the whole. It's always bigger. That's it. Thank you.
Can I jump in briefly, Arthur?
Please do.
Perfect. Yeah, I really appreciate the share, Donna. I think you you framed the limitations of the challenge with having an individual responsible really well. And I think even if it's not just the innovation, an individual responsible for innovation, there is a challenge with it being the goal. And I think this is for me where I look at an innovation portfolio and capability as an exceptional starting point or entry point for enabling transformative change. But if the organization sees or remains or limits what they see as the opportunity to just building an innovation capability, then the real challenge, which is about truly shifting how we understand the governance of a municipality in alignment with its purpose and adapting practices as would be necessary. I'm deeply interested in this innovation work and approach that CPI has been testing, because for us and with enterprise evolution in mind, we need to find really effective starting points, ones where we can demonstrate success reasonably quickly and reliably, and use those initial experiences to build interest in deeper change. From my perspective, though, that deeper change really needs to be fundamental in that, if we think about purpose of government as being centered on enabling the well-being of the communities that they serve, purpose of local government or municipalities specifically, I mean, we have to start to ask some questions about what's necessary in order to do that authentically. So, if we don't understand how our communities are performing inside of science and ethics-based thresholds that define sustainability, how the heck could we possibly navigate the complexity of knowing where to invest limited time, energy, resources in the best way possible to affect change systemically and to address the most significant vulnerabilities and challenges or opportunities that a city faces? And if we don't understand the health of the system and who all the actors are and how they're orienting themselves, how the heck can we as one municipality develop a strategy in isolation and think that that's going to effectively enable the community in the best way possible? It becomes clear as day once we start to really see things systemically that a municipality's role is so much more grounded in facilitation, convening, enablement than it is about the services it delivers. The services are essential and we need to optimize how we deliver those. But at the same time, recognizing that there's much higher leverage points for enabling community well-being than doing what municipalities have always done. And I think until that inauthenticity of current practice versus purpose is more clear and visible, we'll be stuck. And if we're just responding to issues or complex challenges with innovation, we don't get there. So to me, it's about innovation and not necessarily it as an endpoint or a panacea of sorts.
I hear so much resonance in what you were just saying, Randy, with what Brian was saying earlier about how innovation can be threatened under times of austerity or under times of budget crunch, but that can often be when it's more important than ever, because if you're doing service delivery, if you're doing the typical work of government without figuring out these questions first, without understanding the system as a whole, without doing the important upfront work to be able to develop a richer understanding of the root cause, even if you have all the budget in the world, are you even making meaningful progress towards the issue that you're working on? And, this question of, it can often be difficult for cities that are risk averse and that do have real budget constraints to justify what can be upfront time investment, what can feel like, a lot of time researching and learning and studying before taking action. But those are the investments that allow us to deliver something that is meaningful, that allow us to, actually deliver the services that our residents need, designed in collaboration, rather than having a implementation that's cheap up front, but then ends up being much more expensive and ineffective because what you launched isn't really what residents needed and isn't really what was desired, and then you just need to spend more time and spend more money cleaning it up and trying to make a better version. I'll name that because we're already getting great participation from our community here in the main room. We are going to iterate in real time on the design of our webinar today, and we'll just all stay in the main room and continue inviting in participation and conversation with our panelists. And we'll, do that for about 10-15 more minutes, then formally close the webinar and then go into the after party. But because we'll be in the main room the whole time, there will be, less distinction between where we're at now and the after party. Well, we'll continue the conversation, but I'll just note that we'll officially close in about 15 minutes. And, I welcome more conversation from our panelists or anyone else in the chat. Feel free to unmute and hop into our conversation as well.
If I'm allowed to ask, oh, go ahead, Randy.
Please, please.
Oh, I was going to ask, I'd be curious for what is on everybody else's mind, or what brought them here today, and kind of like what they're thinking based on this conversation.
Yeah, you pretty much read my mind, Brian. I was also going to offer a prompt, and I was going to similarly ask, like, if we were to present the same prompts to any of you about what is the challenge that we're responding to, and what is the sort of solution or approach or response that we need, how might you answer that question differently based on what you do or your own unique perspective?
I'll chime in real quick. So I think what brought me here today is very similar to what we had just been talking about. I think the challenge is more about creating space to implement this kind of work rather than implementing the work itself. And I think I've always seen practicing systemic design as a systemic challenge itself, which is characterized by the requirement to shift the paradigm from something that glorifies simplicity to something that embraces complexity. And that's why what caught my attention was the strategic lab, Randy, that you were talking about, as sort of an intervention in itself to kind of overcome that systemic barrier to practicing systemic design in its own right. And I'd be curious to ask you about, what are the key components in the strategic lab that creates these type of openings in the perspectives of the cities that you work with, to open up that space to implement systemic practice through experiential contrasts.
Such a wonderful reflection, Laura. Thank you for that. Yeah, if I could share a little bit more about the experience with Kitchener. I think so much of what we've learned is that the experiences we create really need to be tailored to the audience. And so, the context for us when we began with the city of Kitchener was we connected through someone who I had a long-standing relationship with, which was the head of strategy at the city of Kitchener. I had just come back from doing a bunch of work on enterprise evolution in Norway and shared with her, and she thought that this might be a really good fit for the city. I'd never worked in the municipal sector, but was willing to toe the line. And she introduced me to the head of strategy. I think in 30 minutes, the head of strategy just said, like, she threw all her stuff over the fence and was like, this is what we need to do for the future. This is exactly how I want to innovate and lead. And I'm excited to go down this path. And she very smartly anticipated that none of what we were talking about would work if we were left to her, let's say, authority and accountability as the head of strategic planning, because so much of what we were talking about stretched well beyond what was governed by the strategic planning process or within the scope of it. So she said, we really need to get the senior leadership team on board, the entire team as a whole, as a group, to be supportive of a very different approach that's going to call on them to be supportive and enabling. And so we went through a co-design process, and this is often what we did. We sat with her and her colleague who know all of those senior leaders exceptionally well. And we talked about every single individual who would be in the room and what their tendencies are, how they think about things, who's going to be, divergent and not cooperative, who's likely to be our supporters. And we strategized a little bit. We created a space that allowed for vulnerability, for openness, for sharing. and created safety for them, maybe most importantly, where they could experiment. And in this strategy lab, what we worked on was coming up with something really sticky, something really meaningful to everybody, and that they struggled with in the past strategic planning process, that if it were to have made it, if our strategy lab were to have made a difference against that particular challenge, would really open their eyes to what's possible. And so it was only because of her involvement in this co-design process that we were able to identify something so specific and particular that would naturally engage that senior leadership team. So in this case, they had developed a community level goal focused on the community center of the future, and that they were going to apply this to all the community centers that they were in the process of developing. And they struggled with that. And there's a lot of back and forth and humming and hawing over the design of this goal and what was central to it. So we had them use an innovation called the Flourishing Business Canvas. And again, the Flourishing Business Canvas is a business modeling tool, but we used it in a specific manner. We used it as a means for identifying all stakeholders, for introducing the idea of value co-creation and co-destruction, and then eliciting conversations about how value might be co-created and co-destroyed with every possible actor not limited to the public. So they were able to really think comprehensively and brainstorm using this innovation. And then we used context-based sustainability, the innovation that we used with the city of Nanaimo, to navigate towards science and ethics-based thresholds, to begin a conversation about what impacts were being created and what sorts of information might we need in order to understand whether or not those impacts are happening positively or negatively, and measuring effectively the degree to which they're happening. And so by going through that process, they just simply saw the clarity that emerged, the confidence that was developed when they had a tool that was asking the right set of questions, that was enabling them and encouraging them to be comprehensive, and shifting from individuals in the room all having different perspectives and sharing from a place of opinion, to developing a shared understanding of what's relevant given the goals and objectives they hold, so that they could essentially come to conclusions as a team more quickly, more effectively, and with more confidence. And the outcome of that, so I mean, to give you the long and short of it, we had no history of relationship with the corporate leadership team. We engaged them in the middle of the pandemic virtually. They'd never done a workshop. We had never done a workshop virtually before. This was like 6 or 7 months into the pandemic. They were in emergency response and working 80 hours a week. And literally 5 hours into our 3 half-day sessions, which would have taken us to like the midpoint of it all, they had that experience in the strategy lab and basically just said, you have no experience in the municipal sector. There's no history of enterprise evolution being used by municipalities. We're relatively risk averse, but we think you should help us to figure out how to use these practices to do the next round of strategic planning, because we can't afford to sit on our hands and wait until our current practices really knock us in the face. There's that kind of tailored programmatic approach that we found to be enabling and necessary to create the kinds of outcomes that we did.
Thank you for that. So just to briefly summarize what you just talked about, it sounds like one of the key strategies or components in creating the strategic lab is to find that one problem that's not too small, that people don't care about, and it's not too big, that their risk aversion would become a huge barrier for them to experiment with it. Thank you for that.
Thank you for the
It
prompt.
feels really resonant with the work that Brian and I have done at CPI as well, where we spend a lot of time, helping cities figure out what's going to be the exact right problem to go through this learning program in, one where you're open to new solutions, where you have a longer time frame, where there's some senior leadership support, but senior leadership isn't wedded to a particular solution, using this one area as an opportunity to start learning the skills and, start disseminating the learnings throughout the organization. We have a question for Randy in the chat from Ryan, and I'll read it out, and then Ryan, if you like, I'm happy to invite you off mute to elaborate if you'd like. But it's a question about a slide that you had, Randy, that mentioned creating an area in which people and strategies were safe to fail. And I'd love to hear more about what that looks like, including if you're using agent-based modeling at that point in your process.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ryan. I'm not certain what agent-based modeling is. I'm not familiar with the approach or the method, whatever it might be. but curious to learn more. So feel free to jump in and comment once I finish if you're open to it. Yeah, in terms of creating spaces that are safe to fail, when I think about the work that we did, we didn't enter into the organization and lay out a rigorous process and ask people to follow it to a T, much like the process I described that we had designed for the strategy lab. It's about us getting to know how they do things and understanding their aversions, their own ideas of what was feasible, possible, attractive, unattractive, and counting on the people who knew the others internally to help us anticipate how others were likely to respond. And, we would co-design very different ways of doing things by leveraging quite sophisticated innovations that, we've spent a lot of time as part of the FEI's work curating and identifying from different places in the world. And ultimately, doing the work was all seen as an experiment. We would present exercises, opportunities for them to do what they would normally do in a manner that was unconventional, that they weren't used to doing. And there was no pressure. There wasn't a necessary or fixed outcome that needed to be produced at any given interval. And I think what made it particularly safe was that the design was flexible. What happened at the end, it was necessary because we're in the municipal sector to have some overarching design and to understand where we were going and how we might get there. But as we went along, they became more and more comfortable with the idea that the design was fluid and that we couldn't predict where we would be 4 months from now and what the next step in 4 months' time would be, because it all depended on how the team responded and what we learned through the experience of doing things differently with their staff. So we started in this place of developing a contract in a very conventional way and having to cast important details that they felt were necessary to know that we were going to be accountable and so forth. And by the time we got 6 months in, they just started to appreciate that one, it wasn't necessary, and two, it was in their best interest to just engage vulnerably and with trust with us so that we could navigate well together. And they became comfortable with our expertise and okay with the idea that we needed to learn by doing and really just seeing what emerged at each step. So it was really that experience of sharing, developing a pathway forward that led to this willingness to be a little more vulnerable and for everyone to feel comfortable, given that it was a very different way of working. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Randy. That's very clear. Yeah, thank you. Regarding agent-based modeling, net logos, a good place to look. You can kind of set parameters, and then different agents will respond to different interactions that they all have with each other at the same time. So you can kind of use it for forecasting. What you set the scenario, and then you run the model, and then it will tell you what a likely outcome would look like. So that's what I was wondering, but it sounds like your explanation is very clear to me. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Randy and Ryan. We're getting close to the official close of the webinar, so I'm going to give our closing remarks, but as I've mentioned, we'll have an after party after, so feel free to stay on if you'd like to continue the conversation. It'll be more of what we have now, just dialogue between our panelists and each other. But thank you so much for coming today to our webinar. I'd like to thank Brian, Randy, and Ting as well for being such thoughtful participants and panelists, as well as everyone here on this call, whether you spoke up, asked a question, or whether you were thoughtfully listening and sitting with your learnings. Thank you so much for spending this morning, this afternoon, or this evening with us today. I'm dropping in the chat again the opportunities to join our Reimagining Government community of practice on Slack, as well as to join the mailing list and LinkedIn group for the Flourishing Enterprise Institute, which is Randy's organization. And with that, I will stop our recording as we stop the official webinar. But again, feel free to stick around as long as you want for the after party. Well, eventually we'll have to go to bed or get on with our days, but can stick around for a reasonable amount of time. And thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We truly appreciate the conversation and are grateful for you taking the time to spend with us today.